Hello again. So this is the day after yesterday's video, the hasty elaboration of Web Receptor's idea of anesthetic experience. And this is me, after having watched the video I made, saying, God damn it, there's so much more I wish I could have said, and I feel like it was very cluttered, and I was missing some points, and I want to do a not so hasty elaboration of the idea of anesthesis again. So this is my shot. So the reason the main thing I want to focus in on today, or that has been on my mind since making the video and of thinking about it, is that there seems, to the untrained eye, there seems to be an inconsistency in my framing. And that inconsistency revolves around limits. Early on in the video, I mentioned that I thought Web Receptor's idea that something, in order to be connected, something requires boundaries, or that two things, in order to be connected, require boundaries. I think this is very apt. I think that a connected experience necessitates limitation. It's necessary for boundaries to be in place. And so then I go on to discuss, seemingly on the other hand, that what causes an anesthetic experience is too much limit, too much rigidification. Something is too segmented, it's too organized and hierarchical, and movement ceases to become possible. And I don't think this is an inconsistency, but I realize I have to do a lot of work to explain why it's not. And so that's what I'm going to try to do today. And hopefully I'll be roping in more of my analytic perspective regarding self-psychology and object relations in order to make this more of a conducive whole. I feel like last video, the segmentation, the pacing was a little bit off. So why is it that two things, in order to be connected, need limits? And why is it then that the aesthetic experience of connection requires limits, but an anesthetic experience also seems to come from limits? And I am increasingly convinced that this is because there's two types of limit that we're talking about. And in the obverse, there's two forms of ecstasis. There's two forms of an ecstatic experience, of limitless experience. One which is frightening and unreal making, that makes the world feel unreal, an anesthetic experience, an anesthetic ecstasis. And then there is an ecstasis which is joyful, and is full of movement and fluidity, and is notably makes the world feel more real. That both of these are working in sort of working in slightly different ways that sort of seem the same from the outside, but if you think about it a bit more, it's clear that they're operating on a different level, or in a different way, I guess. So to get into that, I thought I would go over the myth of Narcissus. And I wanted to go over the myth of Narcissus because there is a crucial nugget of information in it that is completely glossed over by the current zeitgeist, that is very preoccupied with narcissism as an expression of excessive self-love and of too much caring about the self, of too strong an ego, when this is really not the case. So if you read the myth of Narcissus, what becomes clear is that Narcissus, when he sees his reflection in the river, right, or in the water, I don't know if it was a stagnant pool or a river or what, it's not that it's not that he sees himself and then falls in love with himself. It's that he sees his reflection, which he does not recognize is himself. He has no idea what he's looking at is a mirror. He really does believe that his reflection is another person, someone capable of love, of loving him back and of being in mutual connection with. And then so goes, he very quickly realizes this is not the case. He can reach into the water and feel nothing. He has no capacity to actually meet this individual, in physical space, or to interact with him on any level emotionally, because of course it's him. But again, of course, he doesn't know this. He has no clue that this is not him. And so I'm pointing this out because I think this is an anesthetic experience par excellence, or par excellence. I've only ever seen it written. I don't know how that's pronounced. Par excellence sounds cooler, so I'm going to say that. But this is, I think, an anesthetic experience par excellence, right? This is an experience where there's no limitation. Narcissists cannot touch this individual, cannot reach this individual, cannot speak to this individual, cannot communicate. There is no interconnection. It is solely an experience of just flowing, and meeting no boundaries. And that this is actually, this is the tragedy, that boundaries, while they would be limiting, would actually result in an aesthetic experience. The limitations of another person is where love exists, right? The other person surprises you. The other person cannot be controlled by you. And, maybe in an infantile sense, this kind of is frustrating, but it's also an excellent kind of frustration. It's a joyous frustration, a joyous limitation, because the surprise is where, all the good stuff is at. And this is sort of the crux, I think, of my argument, or the crux of my concept here, that there are two types of ecstatic experience. There are two types of feeling out of the body, one of which is terrifying and one of which is joyful. This would be an example of this sort of terrifying ecstatic experience. This is an experience where the self feels not in connection with the world. This is anesthesis, right? And this isn't just about the myth. The myth is just a jumping off point to the actual clinical presentation of narcissistic disorders we see, which follow very close in line with the myth. Who could have guessed? Right, where, this is something that Heinz Kohut, I mentioned him in the last video. I didn't give him an introduction. He is sort of the founding father of self-psychology. He wrote some really good books. The Restoration of the Self, The Analysis of the Self, How Does Analysis Cure? I recommend them all. They're very good. And he was very focused on basically what the trend in psychoanalysis seemed like this, right? This is a very hastily put together, I'm jumping over a lot of crucial points probably, but the basic idea is that Freud dubbed narcissism when back in like either the 20s or 30s, and he said, yeah, these individuals cannot be analyzed. They can't be analyzed specifically because they do not form transference. And a transference, for those who don't know, is that's when the therapist, the analyst, becomes a stand-in for someone in that person's life, right? Someone who relates to their therapist as having parts of the father, or parts of the mother, or parts of the this or that. But it's Freud, so it's usually the father or mother, right? And he said, so yeah, narcissists seem to not form these transference relationships. They do not see the therapist as another person in their life. They just sort of see them as something else, which cannot be analyzed. Analysis at that point did not have a capacity to work with a lack of transference. So then Kohut rolls up in like the 60s or 70s. I'm bad at time scales. And he says, well, no, there actually is a transference occurring here. But it's not a transference where the therapist becomes a stand-in for another person in the client's life. It's a self-object transference. It is a transference where the therapist becomes part of that person's self. So connecting this to the myth of Narcissus again, and just to reiterate this, because this is a huge part of my point I'm trying to make here today, this is an example. Narcissism is not about excessive self-love. This is an experience of utter confusion, where the limits of the self are not felt, right? These individuals come into treatment, and not out of malice, but just out of, we'll get into that, but not out of malice, cannot sense that the other is not part of the self. That boundary seemingly does not exist for them. It has not come into being for them. And I'm using that term specifically, coming into being, because this is a result of relational deficit and past experiences which should have formed boundaries, which were not formed. So that's really the level we're working on. And so Kohut recognizes this and writes all these good books on it. And he points out, crucially, that, these individuals they're not happy. They're not having a great time. And not just in terms of, they have trouble forming relationships, they have trouble forming love relationships, they're feeling secure. All of this is true, but there's a more terrifying aspect, which is that these individuals at times really do feel that they lack limitation. They feel as though they are falling forever. That's actually, I don't know if Kohut says that specifically, but a lot of, that's the idea of falling forever is something brought up by the analyst Donald Winnicott. This is one of his earliest fears that an infant feels. It's like falling forever and two other things I forget. So I'm taking Winnicott's ideas and I'm applying them to a lot of what Kohut talks about, because again, I don't think Kohut makes that connection explicit, but you read some of his case studies and you see experiences of people who feel like their body is sort of just flying in all directions, or they feel like parts of their body are sort of not under their control. The literal boundaries of the skin and of the flesh breaking away, right? Of not being a solid individual, but of being a sort of just spreading, almost gas, a gaseous form of self. I'm using a lot of metaphoric language here. Kohut describes this in very different ways, but this is how I see it. And I'll leave it up to you to read more on the subject and come to whatever conclusion you might. So yeah, I hope I'm not just repeating myself for no reason here. This is what I mean when I talk about it. I think this is how I interpret Web Receptor's idea of anesthesis. That the anesthetic experience is of feeling like, well, no, I have to clarify some more. I have to clarify some more there. And the way I'll clarify some more is that, nonetheless, in patients who have narcissistic disturbances of the self, they actually, while they feel this sort of boundarylessness, they also feel this limitlessness, and this limitlessness, this experience of anesthetic ecstasis or ecstasy, while it's terrifying, it's also infinite. It just kind of keeps going forever. And what seems to be the case is that these, an enormous part of the work with these patients is in sort of seeing how this sort of infinite, this feeling of infinity, or maybe even a better term would be a feeling of omnipotence, of, you're not limited, you're not meeting other people, there's no boundaries, but at the same time, these patients seem to have a very firm belief that they can actually control others, that they can control their circumstances, that if they do everything right, if they make themselves look just right, if they speak just right, if they're perfect all the time, they can actually control the world around them. They can control others and their reactions to them. And of course, this never works. And that's a tragedy for them, because it really is. You're in a world that is not under your control. And that's very scary at first, especially if you do not have trust in others that are going to still be there for you when you can't control them. Not aside the point, but getting on with it. My point here, that's the central thing of an anesthetic experience, I think, right? Limited limitlessness. is the way I've been thinking about it for a while now. That it's sort of like this, we're limited, right? We can only be perfect, but within this perfection, we're infinite. We're in this perfect space. There's no room to move outside of the perfect space, but within the perfect space, you can move forever and keep on expanding, right? That's sort of what I think is the operative thing occurring in an anesthetic experience. Rigidification is, and actually, I'm gonna show off my fucking my philosophical swag credentials here. Think of a quote from Gilles Deleuze. I think this is either from what's it called? The one he wrote about Yasser Arafat, or it's the one, or it's Stones, both of which are in the context of Palestine. But he says that that capitalism seems to have two distinct movements, two distinct motions that form the capitalist sort of directionality. These are, first, to impose limits, to draw a little boundary, and to exploit what you've captured. All right, we've captured the city, or we've captured the forest, and now we can exploit the forest. We've captured the forest in these neat little borders, and now we can exploit within them, chop down the trees, build lumber yards, do whatever we can to turn this into furniture or into fuel or into this or that, produce as much as possible within the limitation, right? And that limitation is crucial, right? This forest is no longer a forest. It can't be anything else other than a forest for the manufacturing of goods, right? And the second motion is to then extend those boundaries outward. All right, we've used up all the wood in here. Let's move to this forest adjacent. This forest, this forest, this forest. Keep expanding out. So it's this dual movement that I think is anesthetic. It's to make these limits, to say, okay, there's perfection, or in the case of narcissism, there's perfection of the self-image. In more sociological terms, it's okay, this is what we think is sort of the Platonic ideal of what we ought to do. This is the framework. Now let's exploit what's in the framework and extend the framework outward. A sense of limited limitlessness. The city can grow. The city can expand in all directions. Highways can gird the earth. Like that one Ecstasy song. God damn it. We can expand outward infinitely, maybe. Maybe when we're done with this planet, we can go to Mars and exploit that one. But it's a limited limitlessness. It's sort of it's limitless, but the choices we have are limited. Sure, we can keep on building factories everywhere, but why do we have to keep building factories? Why don't we build anything else? Why even build anything? I'm sort of going off here. I hope you're seeing the through line I'm talking about here. So this is one type of limitation. Now let's talk about the joyous side of things. Let's move away from the horrifying, existential dread of anesthesis towards the concept of aesthetic experience, right? So again, to get back to Web Receptor's idea, right, that connection requires boundaries, right? Again, going back to the myth of Narcissus, right? The tragedy of it is that he's not being surprised. This mirror image of himself is not another person. He cannot genuinely engage in a love relationship with it because it's not a separate other who is separate, who has a mind that can't be read, who acts unpredictably. And so when that other chooses to love you, it's something special. It's not just you're imagining this to happen. You don't have perfect control. Right? So this is also a type of ecstatic experience. This is what I think people typically talk about when they talk about ecstasy, right? It's a sense of limitlessness that is still limited, but in a different way. Rather than the limited limitlessness of anesthesia of, okay, we can only do these things. We can only ever be within this framework, and we can extend the framework out forever, but we can only ever be in the framework. Ecstasy says the framework can change forever. We can always change the framework, the context, right? Which I know I railed on. Maybe we have imperfect language. I'm trying my best to describe a concept here, right? The context can always constantly change. Think of the example I had in the last video of the city that comes into revolution, right? The city has not changed at all. What's happened is that everyone has suddenly come into motion. The streets that I said turned from just places, like ways to get to work, turning into paths of attack or paths of escape. This does not happen because the context changes. This does not happen because the city changes. It happens because the individuals change. And the individuals are in motion. And the individuals say, well, now this is a path of attack, and now this is a path of flight, and now this is a big trading hall, or a place for us all to hang out, or this becomes I don't know. I'm bad at describing this, maybe. But the point is that this is joyous ecstasy, where the frameworks can change. What is possible changes. This is where boundaries are met, right? This is a concept I brought up last time that I think fell flat, but I'm trying to elaborate it more here, right? This is when those limits are met, but then we can bounce and find another limit, and bounce and find another limit, and sort of find new constellations of limitation forever. We never have to get stuck, you know? And that's sort of, that sort of seems to be what happens in the treatment of, on an individual level, people who suffer from narcissistic disturbances of the self. And yeah, treatment is possible. A lot of people don't think that, but that is what seems to be the case. The majority of analytic literature points in this direction. So what happens in treatment is that, essentially, as Kohut calls it, is there's a repeated process of transmuting internalization, or of optimal failure and then transmuting internalization. The patient has these enormous needs. The patient wants the therapist to meet these needs perfectly, and the therapist really does try, within the limitations of what's allowed in a therapeutic context, but to whatever degree is possible, the therapist tries to empathize. The therapist tries to say, yeah, I can see why you really want this. I can see that you really need this, or feel that you need this. And I can tell that it's frustrating that you can't get everything. That sucks for you. Say it in a nicer way than I just did. And then, the patient has to sort of realize, hang on, I'm bumping up against limits, and this sucks. But then the challenge is to stay within those limits, to keep coming back to the therapy context, even after a million tries that always sort of fall flat a little bit, because eventually these become okay. They stop being so traumatic. These failures are not met with total lack of connection. These limits are met with another chance for a different type of connection. Sure, your demand for infinite respect and infinite praise failed today, and it might fail tomorrow. So maybe tomorrow we try something a little bit different, and we try something different after that, and we try something different every day. And so then a self-experience begins. A sense that I'm not boundaryless, I'm actually bounded, but I have the infinite ability to move these boundaries around and find a place where they feel okay, where I never cross another's boundaries, but instead meander around and find the boundaries that work. maybe that's not the best way to put it, and I'm using some sort of like pop psych language, which I don't think is totally applicable, but I hope you get the idea, and I hope you understand what I'm trying to get to today with this whole conversation. So I guess I'll leave you with that, this sort of sense of limited limitlessness, which is anesthetic, then a sort of, I guess you could also call it a limited limitlessness, but so I guess I'll reframe it. An anesthetic experience of unlimited reproduction of framework, and then an aesthetic experience of unlimited movement of the framework. Yeah, that's what I'll leave you with today. I hope you enjoyed. I hope this wasn't too boring. And yeah, again, I hope to see you guys around at any other time. I would love to answer any questions you have, though I know like this is gonna get like 3 views in like 10 years. So, Godspeed. This has been Theo's Analytic Library. And read Heinz Kohut. And damn it, while you're here, read Heinz Kohut, read Ronald Fairbairn, watch Web Receptor, watch Mark Eatonson at Heal NPD, listen to Cade Parker on Spotify. He has some really good music. And I'll see you around.